The release of the new core set Photon Hypernova is going to bring massive changes to the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. Not only are older strategies receiving powerful new support cards that can help them keep up with the current meta, we're also getting the second wave of support for the Kashtira archetype, not only adding another meta deck into the mix, but also further increasing the strength of the current best deck, Tearlament. Among these changes could see a shift from our current method of dealing with those top decks, that being by using board breakers over hand traps, as the amount of hand traps required to keep these decks down could end up being less worth it than simply dropping a board breaker after all is said and done. However, with these new strategies invading the game, will the current board breakers stay the best options, or will change be necessary in order to keep up? And that's why I'm here. What's going on, everybody? It's Aurora YGO coming at you with a brand new video, and it's true that players will definitely need to adapt new strategies and playstyles with the release of Photon Hypernova, and so I'm going to be using this opportunity to showcase what I personally think will be the ranking of our current board breakers in the new format in just a few weeks as of recording this video, so that people may be able to figure out exactly what they need to pick up or look for now, rather than waiting for a time when it's more inconvenient. With this in mind though, please keep in mind that this is going to be based off of the experiences of my personal experiences, as well as others in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Space, as we don't have enough concrete evidence in the TCG as this is a preemptive list, so please make sure that if you do post your opinion in the comments, which I always appreciate, be sure to be respectful of myself as well as others sharing their opinion in the comments or anyone else in the Yu-Gi tubing space, as at the end of the day, it's just a card game and everyone's experiences are different. Also, while I do think that board breakers will still remain the best way to combat the meta threat, if you wish to see which hand traps that you should probably play in case you want to play those over board breakers, then I do have a separate video ranking the hand traps for the format in case you haven't checked it out already. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into my board breaker tier list for the February 2023 format post Photon Hypernova. So unlike with the hand trap tier list where I kind of forgot to do it in the beginning, let's go ahead and go over these tiers, especially because they are pretty unique as opposed to what I usually do. So at the very bottom, we got broke. Instead of broke in, these cards are broke. These cards just don't do enough, if anything at all, and I probably wouldn't recommend playing them in the current format. Minimal means it does just that, minimal damage to the opponent's end board. Though it's not the worst thing you could play, there's probably some better options. Blowout means that while they're not the best ones, they are definitely a big blowout option and will probably win you a lot of games. And then busted, as in the board itself is busted, means that you better not be caught without these board breakers, as they'll probably be able to carry your games on their backs for you. So starting off, we basically have what's the poster child for board breakers as a whole. When people think of board breakers, one of the first ones they usually think of is Dark Ruler No More, and honestly Dark Ruler is still a pretty strong board breaker, even though right now it's not seeing as much play as opposed to other ones, but I think that I'll put it in the blowout category because keep in mind, a lot of people took out Dark Ruler because against a deck like Tearlament, which is the current tier 0 threat, however, I think it'll just be a very high tier 1 deck and still the best deck, but not quite a tier 0 deck once the Photon Hypernova set comes out. People don't like this against Tearlament because they have a bunch of different ways, especially if they have Soliek and the Graveyard Disruptions, where you're really only hitting like 1 or 2 cards on their board, but you still have to deal with like everything else. However, it is still very, very strong against decks like Sprite, and even Fluandereeze, especially if you can combine it with a powerful hand trap in order to disrupt them from getting their trap card. And while it's not the best thing against Kashtira, because keep in mind, if you Dark Ruler a Shangri-La, your zones will still remain blocked. While it's not the most powerful thing, it can definitely hit things like the Arise Heart, it can hit Diablosis to prevent the top of your deck from being milled any further, or even if they're going for the Barrier statue play with Arsenal Falcon, there are a bunch of different things on the Kashtira end board that you can hit with Dark Ruler. Therefore, it's definitely a card that I think if you have the space for it in your side deck and you're not already playing any other board breakers, I feel like it's still a very solid option, especially if you can't afford to pick up some of the more expensive ones. On the topic of Kashtira though, we have Book of Eclipse, and Book of Eclipse is a card, this is also going to count for like Swords of Concealing Light as well because they're almost the exact same card. But Book of Eclipse is a card that was brought back up after having not really seen much play since like 2019, I think, with Thunder Dragon, because Book of Eclipse does something that Dark Ruler can't against Kashtira, and that is unblock your zones whenever the Shangri-La is flipped face down. And the main reason that it's so good against a deck like Kashtira is because they don't have any outs to spell and traps for the most part, so honestly they don't really have outs to like board breakers period, but basically, you don't have to worry about the Book of Eclipse getting stopped by anything, as opposed to like a matchup like Sprite, where, you know, it's not the worst thing against Sprite, but you'd have to combine it with something like Dark Ruler in order to get any actual value out of it. It's just okay against a deck like Tyr, because Like, granted, you can definitely book the Roll Kalos, and like maybe if they have a redo or something in the draw phase, you can book that, and that will turn off things like Solyek or Crime, but you still have to deal with like the Ishizu cards disrupting, and if they have a Havnis in hand or anything else like that, it could end up being really messy and then honestly just not being worth your time. So I will put it in Blowout because it is really strong against a deck like Kashtira, and I guess it is also really good against something like Fluanderies as well, against like something like the Barrier Statue and the Empen. However, it's not really amazing against Tyr, and then Sprite really just could not care less about it. Next up, we have Forbidden Droplet. Again, this is another one of those board breakers that immediately comes to mind whenever you think about it, and Droplet... So the thing is with Droplet is that you really have to worry, like when you're using the Droplet, because cards like Dimension Shifter and now Kashtira Arise Heart can and will completely turn off Droplet from being used, because unlike something like Herald of the Arclight, which just prevents you from using monsters with it from your hand, you literally cannot activate Droplet, period, under something like Shifter or Arise Heart. Not to mention there are still Fluanderies players and other decks that are still playing Dimensional Fissure and Macrocosmos, and so it can be very annoying having a Droplet in hand that you can't even activate. However, Droplet is just such a powerful card because not only can you use it as a board breaker, you can also set it as a mass disruption going first, meaning that even if you get your board broken, if you still have this, you can just completely stop your opponent in their tracks because you can hit multiple things at once, including using your own board broken things, like if they're under a Dark Ruler or something, you can use those as the material and basically not break a sweat. I think that Droplet is definitely a much better card than Dark Ruler overall, but especially in this format. However, I'm kind of teetering on calling it busted, mainly because there are so many cards that can counter it. So next up, we have Lava Golem, and this is also going to apply to Sphere Mode. I'm going to do the same thing at the same time, but these cards are going to be the first ones in our busted category. So these cards are so heavily slept on. Even right now, you can use Lava Golem in Sphere Mode to insta-win you games as long as your deck doesn't need its normal summon. So basically, if you're playing a deck that isn't Fluanderies. Lava Golem and Sphere Mode are just such amazing cards because they have a few things going for them in that it's an inherent summon, it's not an effect to summon, meaning that not only can your opponent not really have an opportunity to respond to it, they also don't really know it's coming, unlike something like I don't know, like maybe they can like tell a Nibiru because you activate the Nibiru effect, but these are an inherent summon, and that also means that they out things that maybe a Towers, like, you know, an Arrival Cyrus at Ignister, or like an Underworld Goddess under an Elf. Mainly it's that it removes the thing from the board, meaning that it's a really good out for cards like Kashtira Shangri-La, or even Kashtira Arise Heart as well. You can hit both of them, and if they have like a Diablosis or something, you can use Sphere Mode to hit all three. And not to mention, both of these cards, especially Lava Golem, can apply to literally almost any single deck in the format right now, be it meta or rogue. Of course, it's mainly really good against a deck like Kashtira, but even against a deck like Tyr, they're typically going to end on like a Roll Kalos and an Xyz, maybe with like a Tyr name on board. Well, you contribute the Roll Kalos and maybe the Tyr name so that they don't have Solyek or anything live, and that doesn't trigger the Tyr effects, including Roll Kalos, meaning that they're basically permanently gone. It turns off their counter trap and their continuous trap, and you still have 5 other cards in your hand. It's really good against a deck like Sprite because you can tribute both the Elf and the Toad at the same time. It doesn't target or anything, so you bypass Elf's protection, and not only do they lose the Toad, they can't summon it back like if you were to hit it with something else, because the Elf is also gone as well. Admittedly, unless a Flunder player goes for both Empen and Apex Avian on their end board, or goes for something else, or like you have Imperm along with your Lava Golem for the Barrier Statue, it's not the best against Flunder. However, it can come up in certain situations, and that's honestly why I think Lava Golem is just such a perfect side deck card, and even to an extent Sphere Mode. Next up, we have Evenly Matched, and y'all, Evenly Matched is like still the supreme reigning card when it comes to board breakers, so maybe I'm actually going to put it under Lava Golem, but above Sphere Mode, because Sphere Mode's a little bit more specific than Lava Golem, so it's weaker. However, I think that Evenly Matched is not as strong as Lava Golem, because Lava Golem can out things like Omni Negates, like the Toad. And then also, if you tribute the Shangri-La with the Lava Golem, you don't have to worry about them just keeping the Shangri-La, and then all your zones are still blocked if they keep the Shangri-La. But Evenly Matched is just such a strong blowout card. Like, seriously, it's probably one of my favorite cards of all time when it comes to going second, because you are forcing your opponent to keep only one of their things, but everything else, instead of like getting sent to the graveyard or getting banished or something, they're all banished face down, meaning that almost none of them can ever get those cards back. It's also a trap card, meaning that it's very, very hard to actually stop unless you're playing something like Sprite and they get the Toad on board, but you can easily just bait the Toad negate and then maybe hit it out of grave with something with like, you know, a DD Crow or whatever, or just hitting the elf with something like an Imperm during this, like during the battle phase or something. It remains probably just one of the best ways to get your opponent to your level, especially considering that because you have to use your battle phase to do it, at least making them keep only one card, and maybe like a Shizu cards in graveyard when it comes to tier limit, you can at least go off in your main phase 2 to try to set up a board yourself, and then have your opponent try to use their minimal resources, that you at least hope they only have minimal resources, in order to try and break your board in turn. Not only is it just probably one of the best side deck cards, I've honestly been main decking it for the last while in both Fluanderies and in Bird Up, and I've been seeing nothing but success with it. It's just such a strong card, not to mention the fact that it's not even a once per turn, so even if they stop it with something that doesn't negate activation, you can easily just slap down another one from your hand. Next up we have Harpy's Feather Duster, and I mean, Feather Duster is an okay card overall, however, right now we're not really experiencing any mass trap decks. Granted, I do think you should definitely at least have a Duster in your side deck, because Duster is, of course, Duster. I mean, it's going to blow out any back row matchup that you may have. It's just not like the most amazing thing to play, especially not enough like a main deck Duster format, which I have seen before. So I'm going to put it in minimal because, admittedly, it does just completely blow out back row decks. The problem is that there's just not as many back row decks, and actually I wouldn't call that a problem given that back row is just really annoying, especially because half the time it's just continuous floodgates. So keep in mind that when I put it in minimal, I'm not saying what it does is minimal, I'm just saying that there's minimal reason to like really need it right now. Next up we have Forbidden Chalice, and honestly I do like Chalice as a card, however it's honestly just a worse version of something like Forbidden Droplet, because granted, while you can use it under something like Shifter, I mean, it's just really not the most amazing thing. It's just a 1-for-1 trade-off, not to mention that the monster actually gains attack, which could end up being a bad thing, especially for something with like 3k attack, because 3k is probably one of the most common boss monster attack stats, and so if you can't get over that monster afterwards, then it's just kind of sitting there. I do like that you can use it like during the middle of your turn or in the middle of a chain link like something like Droplet, as opposed to something like Imperm, which we will get into. However, it's just not the most amazing card you could use, at least not in a format that's as fast-paced as this. Speaking of Imperm though, I'm going to put Imperm just above Chalice. They effectively almost do the same thing, but the difference is that Imperm, while it can't be used during like the middle of your turn, I mean, I would hope not at least, I hope your board isn't like that completely busted, it can be used as a hand trap, which obviously if you can stop your opponent from making the board in the first place as opposed to having to chip apart their board, that's even better. And then also it can negate the column, which is really huge, especially when your opponent is not really paying much attention to your face downs. And so while essentially when it comes to board breaking, it does almost the exact same thing as Chalice, I think overall Imperm is just a better card. Next up we have Kaijus, and I mean like specifically just single one-off Kaijus, and these aren't the worst thing you could play. Like, I'll admit it, like you could probably play worse things. Minimal or broke. Honestly, I don't think very many things at all will be going into broke, but I guess I'm gonna put it in broke simply because if you're gonna use Kaijus, unless you just really need your normal summon that bad, like, just play a Lava Golem, because, I mean, because you could Kaiju someone, right, but you're only getting rid of one threat on their end board. Like, if you're going against, like, a Kashtira player, and they have a Shangri-La blocking 3 of your zones, they got a Diablosis, they got an Arise Heart, and then they got, like, I don't know, a face down Prep or something, and then obviously whatever they summon off of these Shangri-La, like, yeah, you could probably get rid of the Shangri-La and get your zones back, but you're still dealing with a walking Macrocosmos, the Diablosis ripping things from the top of your deck, you got the Prep probably in the back row, and then you have whatever they summoned off of Shangri-La either ripping into your extra deck or from your field, and honestly, it's just a really bad situation, and you kind of just wasted a card in your hand that could have been something like a Dark Ruler instead. I will be skipping ahead one though to talk about the counterpart to Kaijus being Kaiju Slumber, and Kaiju Slumber of course is slightly better than Kaijus at least because it does block the entire board. Admittedly though, actually I'll put it below Duster, because admittedly you do have to run all of the Kaijus as well, and I mean, that's not that bad honestly, because say you open like a Kaiju and a Kaiju Slumber, remember you can still Kaiju Slumber when there's already a Kaiju on board, so you can like tribute the Gamma Seal on top of the Shangri-La and then use the Kaiju Slumber to get rid of everything else, but that does still rely on like opening multiple things. Actually because of that I will put it above Duster, but it's mainly that you could end up bricking potentially on the Kaijus, especially because you can only control one, that I'm going to put it in minimal as opposed to something like Blowout. Next, we have Dark Hole, and honestly, Dark Hole is just kind of worse than Kaiju Slumber because Dark Hole will bait a negate or force a negate out, against something like Sprite, but remember that with the Kaijus, at least with Kaiju Slumber, again, if you open a Kaiju and Kaiju Slumber, you can out the Shangri-La and the rest of the board, but Shangri-La can actually protect itself if you're going straight for the Dark Hole. Not to mention that Dark Hole is just going to be really bad against something like Tyr, whereas with the Kaiju Slumber, you can just tribute the Royal Kalos and then blow everything up. Well, if you're going to just blow up the Royal Kalos without using the Kaiju, it's just going to summon itself back. Basically, I think Kaiju Slumber overall is just a little bit better than Dark Hole. The main reason Dark Hole was good like a last format, or maybe like 2 formats ago, I should say, is because Mystic Mine was a thing, and with Mystic Mine a thing, Dark Hole was like the easiest way to out everything, so the Mystic Mine died. But at the moment, I just feel like there's way better options you could play. Next up, we have Kurikara Div Incarnate, and y'all, like, I don't want to say Kurikara is a bad card, like, it's not awful. Like, but I think that there's just better options to play. Like, I feel like Kurikara, letting your opponent use the effects of things like, you know, an Appaloosa or like an Arise Heart or like things like that, I feel like letting them use those effects and then outing the thing could have just been solved by using a Lava Golem, you know? Like, I saw people were like, oh my god, this is like the new Nibiru, but like, I'd rather just use the Nibiru during my opponent's turn and like stop them from making the board in the first place, then not only allow them to make the board, but also let them use 1 or 2 disruptions and then using this card and then trying to use whatever I have left to salvage the turn. Like, if you can get her onto the board, she can become pretty large, and then like during the end phase, if there is still an end phase, which you probably should try not to have an end phase, she does get to steal something from the opponent's grave, and that could be pretty good. I honestly feel like you should just play something like Lava Golem or even Sphere Mode instead. Therefore, I will be placing it. It can be a blowout because, you know, things like Shangri-La, obviously, and it can work on things like Dweller or Redoer in the Tier Element matchup, and I mean, it can work on, like, it can get rid of certain things for later, like Elf, so I'll put it at the bottom of blowout, because if it does resolve, it is kind of a blowout, but I feel like you could just literally use Lava Golem, y'all. Another card that's going to be going in blowout is going to be Lightning Storm. I really like Lightning Storm. I think it's a very strong card. I'm going to be putting it probably above Eclipse because it has more usage. Let's see, actually, above or below Dark Ruler is my big thing. So, because a lot of things float, and then certain things will just be going in defense, honestly, like Arise Heart and Shangri-La and things like that, and also Shangri-La could protect itself anyway, I'm going to be putting it below Dark Ruler, but what I really like about Lightning Storm is just the flexibility. Being able to blow up either monsters or back row is huge, especially in a format where, honestly, while back row decks aren't really prevalent, even the top combo decks right now, like Sprite, could end up setting a bunch of back row. You know, you got Smashers, Double Cross, a Starter, even things like Imperm or Droplet. The Lightning Storm can at least get rid of those easily, or you could just go for the throat and just go after the monsters. Yes, it is not that amazing against a deck like Tyr, but it can out certain things on the board that could be problematic in other matchups. Next up, we have Bootleg Lightning Storm, though. We have Raigeki. People actually seem to think that it's Raigeki that Lightning Storm is based off of when it's actually Lightning Vortex, so the more you know. But Raigeki is going to be going probably above Kaiju Slumber, but below Chalice and Imperm. It's basically just better because it outs everything on your opponent's board rather than on both boards, and like, yeah, it kind of suffers the same fate as Dark Hole, but like, at least you can't potentially blow your own things up. Actually, now that I think about it, I might put this below Kaiju Slumber because, again, opening a Kaiju plus Slumber is kind of just insane, as opposed to, like, just eating a negate with the Raigeki and the Dark Hole, whereas you can Kaiju the negate and then just Kaiju Slumber everything else. I really like Kaiju Slumber now that I think about it. And while it's just so weird, admittedly, to think that cards that literally say destroy all of your opponent's monsters or destroy all monsters on the field, it's weird to think that those cards just aren't that amazing, but it's just, in a format with so much protection and floating, or just negates for these kind of things, it's just really wild to think about. Actually, I will be putting Raigeki above Kaiju Slumber now that I think about it, because I have to remember that when you're playing against a deck like Flu, a card that blows up all your opponent's monsters is really big. Not to mention that if you're doing the Barrier Statue, like, after, like, you start playing, then you don't want to nuke your own monsters with something like Dark Hole, and then also, you don't want to nuke them with Kaiju Slumber either, not to mention that because they have to have different names, I think there's only one Wind Kaiju. Let me look it up. Kaiju. Yeah, so there's only one Wind Kaiju, and they have to have different names. So I'm pretty sure you can't even use the Kaiju Slumber under Barrier Statue. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I think Raigeki in that matchup is a little bit better. But overall, I think as a card, Kaiju Slumber is probably better. So actually, I will just keep Kaiju Slumber over Raigeki because it's better in the 3 other matchups. Next up, we have Super Poly. And Super Poly, yeah, it's a card that's not seeing as much like main deck use and only like a little bit of side deck use here and there I've seen, as opposed to like at least my locals. But I'm still going to put Super Poly probably... so Super Poly can't hit as many things as Dark Ruler, probably, especially because Dark Ruler is technically a little bit better in the tier matchup than Super Poly. So I'll put Super Poly above Lightning Storm, but below Dark Ruler. But y'all, Super Poly is just such a stupid card. Because like I think the discard is meant to be like a big steep cost or something, when most of the time it just benefits people because they want their things in the graveyard. It's a quick play, so you can set it going first and then use it as a disruption. You can use it to tear through a board. And then let's be real, if you're going second and using it as a board breaker, Garura doing double damage comes up a lot more than people may think. And honestly, there's just really no downside to the card. The only problem with it is that like when tier is taking up more slots than anything else, you don't want your tier opponent plussing by fusing their stuff off, even if it's to make your stuff. So it's like the main like reason it's not seeing enough play. But I think if tier goes from being a tier 0 threat to like a really, really high tier 1 threat and still the best deck, I think it might see more use, mostly in the side deck, but I just think it's such a strong blowout card overall. Next up, we have Triple Tactics Talent, and honestly, this is probably one of my favorite cards in the game right now, and I think I want to put Triple T above Kurikara for sure, but above or below that. Actually, I'm going to put it above Lightning Storm. So the interesting thing about Triple T is some people might not think it's a board breaker, but it does take something from the opponent. But I like the other uses that it has as well, because it can be used in many different ways, even going second. So the hand rip is actually really big in case you already break your opponent's board with something else, because opening a board breaker plus Triple T is just heavenly. So you can not only break your opponent's entire board, but you can further limit their resources by ripping a card from their hand, and because it shuffles, they don't have a way of triggering the thing that you rip. Not to mention, even drawing 2 cards after baiting out your opponent's stuff with other things, like say you open like Evenly or Lightning Storm plus Triple T against like a Sprite player. Well, of course you're going to use the board breaker in order to bait out the Toad, but then you can draw 2 cards off the Triple T, and that can draw you into not only more ways to play around your opponent's stuff, but it could even draw you into more board breakers. But then of course the only actual one that directly breaks a board is the stealing of a monster, and honestly this effect is just so broken, because not only does it not target, but stealing your opponent's monster is just absolutely huge, because not only are they losing the monster, but you're gaining the monster as well as any effects that it may have. I know it's not seeing as much play in the top decks right now, but stealing something like say an Appaloosa with like 2 or 3 negates before doing your own combo could be absolutely game warping, because you can stop your opponent's disruptions while they're trying to stop you. It can also be huge in a matchup with Kashtira cards, like either going against Pure Kashtira or Kashtira, the Kashtira Tearlament hybrid, which will probably take over as the best deck. Because if they have like a Unicorn or a Fenrir on board, not only can you steal that monster to get its effect to rip from the extra deck or banish a card in the field, but you can also use it to search if you're also playing Kashtira or a Kashtira variant, and you can use it as a level 7 for your rank 7 plays. I think Triple T is a really, really strong card. I mean, I would hope so, considering it has 3 banned card effects on it. Well, technically 2 now that we have Change of Heart back, but regardless, for all of those reasons, it is going to be going into the blowout category. So next up is Ultimate Slayer, and it's so weird how Ultimate Slayer went from one of the most hyped cards that I've seen in a while to one of the biggest flops in the current market of Yu-Gi-Oh! History. This isn't to say that Ultimate Slayer is a bad card though, and I will be putting it probably below, above Impermanent Chalice or below Impermanent Chalice. Strictly due to how much play it's seeing, I'm actually going to put it below Kaiju Slumber. So the biggest problem with Ultimate Slayer is that you have to commit the extra deck resources in order to get the most value out of it. Because, like, yeah, it's really cool that you get to send something from the extra, and then not only prevent your opponent from responding to you shuffling one of their monsters back, but you also get the effect of the thing you sent, but most decks, their extra decks are just so damn clogged nowadays. Honestly, I feel like the extra deck should increase anywhere from 18 to 20. Konami, that'd be awesome. But with such little space in the extra deck, the only decks that can really afford to play this card are decks like Flu. But at that point, if you're playing Flu, you can probably just play a better board breaker, something like Evenly Matched. And even I personally would rather just use my Flu extra deck for Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. It's definitely not the worst board breaker of all time. There are plenty more, especially on this list, that are like just definitely worse. But I think compared to some of the other ones that you could play on this list, Ultimate Slayer just isn't like the greatest card. So next up we have Underworld Goddess. I know it may be a little bit weird to call this a board breaker, but considering both its effects and its summoning condition, I would definitely qualify it as a board breaker. So much so, I think this card is actually good enough to be in the blowout category. I'm gonna put it probably above Super Poly, actually, because while it doesn't get rid of as many things, you have to understand that decks like Tyr and Sprite and like certain other decks, basically anything that isn't playing Access Code, cannot out towers, and even to an extent, can't out things that can't be targeted or destroyed by battle, especially in Tyr's case. It's so funny watching Tyr try to out my Lyrilusc Assembled Nightingale with a Cobalt Sparrow under it. But if you can't out a towers or something with a certain kind of protection, not only does Underworld Goddess get rid of that monster, but it also has a massive blowout effect of any other monster that they have on the field left, because it's literally just a mass skill drain. Not to mention that it has protection, so your opponent has to have something that would target it in order to negate the mass blowout effect. And on top of that, it has a negate, like essentially a Ghost Bell type of negate on top of all of those other things. Not to mention that the summoning is an inherent summon as well, so you could have like a Link 2 and 2 other monsters on board, and then like you have like literally anything, and you might not think of much, but your opponent could literally just jump scare you into going into an Underworld Goddess, and you won't even have a chance to blink. Not to mention with cards like IP Masquerena, which are increasingly popular, you can easily go into this on your opponent's turn, making it similar to something like Super Poly or Droplet, in that you can use it on your opponent's turn. I think Underworld Goddess is one of the most amazing flex spots in your extra deck that you can have if you have the space, and personally, I feel like it is one of the craziest blowout cards that you could have right now. And then finally, we have Divine Arsenal Zeus, one of my favorite cards in the entire game. And y'all, this is basically just harder to use Dark Hole or Raigeki or things like that, but I think I would like to put it, so it's definitely a massive blowout card, and honestly, I do want to put it, I'm going to put it below, I'll put it above Kurikara, but below Book of Eclipse. Because Zeus, yes, you definitely have to go through all of the things in order to actually get it out, but the thing is, if you do get through all of those things, like if you get through the Toad negates, or if you get through the Roll Kalos and everything like that, or you get through like everything else on the board, especially against a deck like Kashtira, blowing out their entire board after the fact could actually be even easier than blowing out their board beforehand, because while something like Dark Hole or Raigeki is there to usually bait a negate rather than actually blow everything up against a deck like Sprite, this basically prevents them from having that extra follow-up on board, and can easily help turn the game in your favor, especially because you typically still have resources in your hand after making this. Granted, it is definitely a little bit of a specific card as opposed to other things, because you do have to actually be playing a deck that makes Xyz monsters, especially ones that have protection or can attack directly, but I think that Zeus is definitely going to go up a peg in this format as opposed to last format, because there will probably be a little bit less tier, and it's really good against a deck like Kashtira. But that is going to have to do it for my board breaker tier list. There are probably some that I missed, even though I did intentionally avoid some because they weren't really like important enough, or like they weren't specific enough as a board breaker in order for me to put it on here. But if you do want to see me like talk about one of those in the comments, then I will definitely respond to you in the comments section. And some of these also could be subjective, because it does depend on not only the deck that you're playing, but also your matchup. So these could probably interswap some changes a little bit here and there. Not to mention that the broke category probably just didn't even need to be there, like considering that this can easily go into the minimal category as well. I just figured this was probably the only thing that could go into the broke category, so I put it there. But I think overall, especially for choices like Lava Golem and things like that, I think this is a fairly accurate board breaker tier list for the Photon Hypernova format. But that is just my opinion. Let me know yours down in the comments below, because that's going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as I'll split this video and the channel into 2 recommended. And if you like this content and you want to see more like it, I'm trying to make more tier lists because they are received very positively, then perhaps consider subscribing, because we're going to try to hit 5,000 subscribers by the end of 2023. Not to mention, it supports the channel more than anything else, and it's absolutely free. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.